Independent energy analyst Clyde Mallinson joins us now to discuss this. A very good evening to you, Clyde, and thank you so much for speaking to us. If we were to play the verbal version of Pictionary, what would a total blackout look like for South Africa?
Pretty much the opposite of this.
A white balance.
Yes. But yeah, you know, it's tragic, in fact, that we've got to this level, that we've got ourselves into this point, because many of us have been speaking for, 5-6 years now that we're heading towards this. And the fact that we're now having to prepare for the potential eventuality of a so-called blackout or a collapse in the grid is quite frankly a serious indictment on all of us, our policy planners, Eskom, DMRE, everyone. We saw this coming, we knew it was coming, and we seem not to have reacted rapidly and urgently enough until it's actually become, we declared a disaster. And so I know it's easy to say that that's history and we've got to look forward, but I just want to stress the fact that this wasn't unexpected. It's not an unannounced shock. We've seen it coming for a long time now, and the tragedy is that we didn't do anything about it when we could have.
I mean, I was just listening to Mr. Fioma there speaking to my colleague Nompumelelo Siziba about how South Africa ought to learn lessons from where Nigeria has been. And this is what a lot of African countries have been warning us for a good 20 years now, saying that we shouldn't repeat their mistakes. So what should we learn? And I'm just curious, when we say total blackout, do we mean something that goes on for days, where we don't have power and there is just no helping us get back on a grid, even if it's for 2-hour reprieves?
Yeah, okay, so the way it works is the grid itself needs energy to keep it alive, so to speak. So picture the grid as an appliance, if you like, and it needs about 2,000 megawatts to keep the grid energized. And if a collapse of the grid means the grid loses its energy, and it has to be re-energized. And of course, if the grid loses its energy, the grid is it's the thing that connects us all to the power generation. It connects power generation to demand. And so if you've lost your grid, one way of thinking of it maybe would be as if we had a mass flood in the whole of South Africa and all the roads were underwater. What would that do? Well, it's the same kind of thing. If the grid collapsed, we wouldn't be able to generate to feed onto the grid, and we wouldn't be able to extract electricity from the grid. So it would be nothing short of calamitous if the grid were to collapse. And the reason we have load shedding is to strive with every kind of ounce of our strength to prevent the grid from actually going into a so-called cascading collapse. And that's why we have load shedding. And the bigger the gap between what we're generating and what we're consuming, the more we have to reduce our consumption by introducing load shedding. And as long as we can keep the balance between demand and supply balanced, we won't have a grid meltdown. But it gets more and more difficult, and it becomes almost academic. If we move on to stage 8 plus load shedding this winter, for example, we won't have electricity for half of the day. And that means that it's akin almost, it's not as bad, it's by no stretch of the imagination as bad as not having any electricity. But in terms of the economy, I think it would be equivalent to a technical knockout punch. So, yeah, we've got ourselves in an almighty pickle.
And I do want to go back to the issue of the lessons we can learn from other countries and if they're comparable. I know Nigeria has a larger size of population to service, but just looking at the open cycle gas turbines, for instance, the decision by Eskom not to refuel them at some point last year, many have said will bring us closer to a total blackout. Now, the power utility said that the tanks will not be replenished with diesel until the 1st of April 2023 as its spending overrun on diesel to date. It's twice the budget for the current financial year. So what does this mean?
Okay, well, starting off with your first question, I don't think many of the other countries in Africa are comparable to South Africa in terms of the size of our grid and our generation. So Nigeria, if I remember correctly, probably has about 5 times the population of South Africa, but it produces about 1/10 of the amount of electricity. So I don't think these good comparisons. Perhaps what one can say of Nigeria and some other countries is they've learned to exist with much less electricity and less reliable electricity. And our problem is we've had lots of relatively reliable electricity, and the difficult comes in if you're used to having something and it then gets taken away. It's much more difficult to adapt than if you're not used to having it in the first place. That's the first point. The second point is Eskom have been spending money on diesel since December. I track the Eskom and the IPP diesel usage, and they've been spending money in January and February and March, in fact, to run the open cycle gas turbines. But it looks to me as if the usage of those open cycle gas turbines is very much a function of when they've got some money, if I can put it that way. So when they've got a bit of extra money in the kitty, they run them. And when they haven't got enough money, they actually don't run them. And there's not a very good correlation between when they are run and when they aren't run, so to speak, relative to load shedding. So we're in permanent load shedding at the moment. So technically speaking, we should run them as frequently as possible, because it's cheaper to run the diesel open cycle gas turbines than it is than what the effect on the economy of not running them is. The problem is Eskom has to pay for the diesel for running those, whereas the economy pays for load shedding. And if Eskom hasn't got money, it kind of says, well, I haven't got money. I'm sorry what it's doing to the economy, but what must I do? I haven't got money. And if I spend money, I get into trouble with NERSA. So once again, we're not we're short of electricity overall, but we're not short of open gas turbines. We're short of money to be able to run them.
And just looking at what the new electricity minister has to do, I mean, we just mentioned that we're now going on to stage 5 as of tonight and tomorrow, and Eskom saying that several generating units, although they've successfully returned to service, you've got others who have now had to come off because they have to be serviced. Is it as haphazard as it may appear to some of us? Because as soon as we're promised that weekends are when we go to lower stages, then we're told no, but these have to go in for service. I thought servicing and maintenance is something that is planned. And secondly, I just want to understand, what is the cost of unserved energy for South Africa's economy, given all of these things?
Look, that's a very difficult question to ask. These big discussions between myself and others and Eskom. The one way of looking at it is to say the cost of load shedding is 10 Rand a kilowatt hour because people have to run diesel and whatever instead of load shedding. But many economists would argue that the higher the stage is of load shedding, the greater the cost of an extra stage on the economy. And some people have said that the true cost to the economy is probably as high as 90 Rand a kilowatt hour. And some of that true cost to the economy is very difficult to quantify. And some people who analyze these things just ignore it because they say, well, we can't quantify it. And because we can't quantify it, we just sort of pretend it doesn't exist. So I would argue that it's a bit like wind or earthquakes. It's not a linear scale. Stage 1 load shedding isn't only a quarter as bad as stage 4. Stage 4 is like 10 times worse than stage 1, not 4 times worse, if you see what I'm getting at. So it's terribly damaging to the economy. And as we move particularly into stage 6 and above, we start getting knock-on effects on things like sewerage and water and all sorts of other things. And businesses start collapsing, food starts going off, the cold chain breaks down, the ability of farmers to keep the cold chain of producing food and getting it to the wholesalers and eventually to the retailers, that starts breaking down, and there's huge wastage. And it is difficult to quantify the cost. But I think the fact that we're moving into a recession at the moment indicates that we're talking multiple percentage points on our GDP, if not 5%. And some economists have said that since we've started with load shedding, our economy is perhaps as much as 10% lower now than what it would have been had we not had load shedding since 2008. So it's a cumulative effect. To try and measure it on a one-by-one basis while we're having load shedding is not particularly useful. And I must say, when you introduced the topic, I detected an air of resignation from you when you were reading out the Eskom statement again about this one's up and that one's down. And the fact is that there's a difference between risk and uncertainty. Risk is something you can quantify, and you can say, this is what we think the risk is. Uncertainty is when you actually can't quantify the risk. You just don't know. And the words Eskom used to describe their coal fleet in many of their presentations are unreliable, uncertain, unpredictable. All those unwords mean that they don't actually know what's going to happen, and that's the scariest bit. It's like driving an unreliable car. Am I going to get to my destination or not?
I'll tell you what, Clyde, you may have shone a light on my reticence, but it's not a complete blackout. There is a sliver of hope, because that's the only way we can survive. But thank you so much for your time and your insights, independent energy analyst Clyde Mallinson, just speaking to us about some are talking about the possibility of a total blackout and what plans they've put in place to overcome it should we reach that point.